Welcome to the Revenue Blueprint. This is not another sales podcast on tips and tactics. Instead, we focus on unfiltered stories from founders and early stage sales leaders on what it takes to build a successful revenue team. If you get just a little bit of value from this, we ask that you pay it forward by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the podcast. All right, let's get into the episode. Back to another episode of the Revenue Blueprint. I'm joined with my co-host as always, Seth. How's it going, man?
Good. Excited to see you, buddy.
Excited to see you as well today. So we've been talking a lot about kind of the evolution of Revenue Blueprint and why we started it.
Now that we're rich and talking about this stuff.
We made so much money off it. It's kind of ridiculous. I'm not recording
so much we don't even have to have ads. Boom.
Right. I'm actually on a beach in Bali right now. This is just a green screen in my basement.
Smart.
But I think the kind of Revenue Blueprint and its purpose has continued kind of evolve for us over time.
Yeah.
And one of the topics that we've talked about a lot recently is remote work and bridging that gap between remote and in-person, and how we think Revenue Blueprint can be some type of go-between there, some kind of bridge. So why don't you talk through some of your thoughts on that?
For sure. So first, I'll talk about and I explained it in our newsletter that's coming out in the next few weeks about our purpose of Revenue Blueprint. Also, I've been talking to a lot of founders and sales leaders about remote work. And I think actually Revenue Blueprint was born out of remote work. And what I mean by that is I've been working on my own for the past 1,200 days of not being in an office. And before that, I was always leading teams in the US or in Europe. And then I was advising. So I was in office in different cities, with these awesome teams. And that was my community. And then all of a sudden, COVID happens, everything's remote. And in many ways, it's improved our lives and there's a lot of benefits from it. And that can be a debate for another time of all the pros and cons. And maybe we get to that today. But that left me wanting more community and more interaction with teams that, support a healthy lifestyle, a healthy kind of mental state. And I've always found that with other people. And so you and I bonded over that and said, hey, let's start talking. And we started talking. And then some of our posts went viral and people said, you should interview people. And then where do you do that but on a podcast? And here we are talking right now to an audience. And so I think that purpose, and someone asked, why are you doing all this? Why are you doing a podcast? Why are you doing a newsletter? And I think it comes back to a community and finding a way to be able to have in-person events, bringing people together. So it's not just us expanding our network and making great relationships, but those people making great relationships, right? And not doing with like a hardcore, you got to go to a conference, you got to do this in person, but having more curated events. And so I've told you that about this in the past, that I've been doing these adventures for the past, 5-10 years with groups of friends where we call them adventures, get together with a group of friends, spend an awesome night in a city, go into nature, get kind of spiritual, let's say, doing hikes, nature stuff, playing poker, grilling, fun times. And much of this is around business. And so I have such warm memories of each of these events that I've done. And so the fact that we're doing Revenue Blueprint and we're starting to build this community and we're getting to know people and growing our own network, we have an opportunity to bring these people together in awesome spaces, right? In nature, to go, selfishly fly fishing or just hiking or just chilling in a really nice spot in nature and talking about our struggles in business and life and all of these things, and then being able to come away from it. So it's less, I want to start planning our next one. I think it's probably going to be either in the fall or in the spring. We both have a lot of moves and stuff going on, but bringing people together in a really nice way, because all of my fondest memories are always in person. I have few that I'm like, that Zoom call, man, that was incredible. And I think you're seeing with all these remote companies having to do awesome in-person events. My friend just launched a company called Wilder. He's been doing outdoor adventure for incredible companies, leading them. Abercrombie & Kent is the most recent one he's been working at. But before that, he had a company in New York called Discover Outdoors. And now he's doing corporate retreats in nature settings with some sort of spectrum between like more business in an awesome setting or more adventure bonding in an awesome setting. And it's like, yeah, you got to do these things. And so it's like a lot of these things are coming together around this purpose of why we're doing this, which is not just you and I getting a chance to talk and then obviously growing our community and building awesome relationships with people, but allowing them to do that in an awesome spot. And so that's kind of the purpose behind that. And then we can get into like how remote work is affecting teams and that type of stuff in a minute. But I think one of the obvious side effects of remote work is this lack of community, lack of purpose for us humans, right? That really enjoy life in person, and trying to bring that together through this community that we're already building. And so I think that is a foundational aspect of our purpose, gives me
I think
excitement.
I mean, listen, humans are wired to want to spend time with each other physically, right? Like there's science behind that. And so the trade-offs of remote work and being in this environment, there are pros and cons, but there's no doubt humans have a natural tendency to want to spend time with other humans. And I think you see examples of this all over the place. You ever met someone that went to summer camp as a kid? They still remember the songs. They
Wow.
still
Ask
like
them
best.
about it. They won't stop talking about it because it's vivid
Exactly.
and awesome.
Exactly. It's the same reason like sports teams, they'll go away for training camp sometimes, right? They'll go to more isolated environment. And it's those constraints of where you are in an isolated environment and you're going through something with other people that are in a similar spot in life as you, whether that's other business professionals, whether it's your teammates on a sports team, you are kind of forced to create these bonds with people. And oftentimes when you're creating those bonds, you make awesome memories. And I agree with you like that. Some of my most favorite memories are hanging out with my best friends when there's no one else around and it's just us, right? Or like going on trips with my wife and it's just us or just the kids, whatever it is, right? Like being away from the normal environment, but doing things in person. And I think there is, particularly for Revenue Blueprint, right, where we are focused on early stage revenue, there's a lot of people going through a lot of the same type of stuff. And the conversations that we have with these folks aren't always around just like tactics, right? It's more about the stories and the camaraderie of going through all this stuff together. And I think I'm really excited to hopefully plan a couple of these trips to get some folks from the community together. Again, we'll put ourselves in a more isolated environment. We'll be in person and we're all going through a lot of the same stuff.
And also some of the best memories I've had are in-person office environments where we're learning together, where we're pulling as a team. You know, you have a team goal and individual competition, and everyone's just fired up to do sales. And it's like, isn't that awesome that I'm excited to do something that can really be terrible at times?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I have these wonderful memories of these experiences that now that things are remote, it's far harder to do that. And I think that's why I'm gravitating towards this. So let's transition into kind of some of the pros and cons of remote work. I have some strong opinions, but I'd love to hear your framework on how you tackle this topic with just discussing it at a high level with someone who's exploring what to do next as they scale their team.
I think so. This is, and we'll try to keep it under the lens, particularly of early stage teams, but we went through this at my last company at Close Right, where COVID hit and we decided we shut all our offices down. We shut down our plans for opening a new office and we went fully remote. And I think that there are trade-offs that you have to consider. And I don't think there's actually a right or a wrong answer. I think it just depends what
politically correct.
It just depends what's most important to you or what your team has or what it doesn't have. And you should index for filling in that gap, right? So I think particularly if you really need access to more talent because you can't find that talent locally, then virtual makes sense. I think training in person is always easier, right? It's faster. You can react much faster. You get more micro cues from someone's body language or whatever it is, right? So that's easier. So if you're training large classes of people, doing that in person, like it's something I would recommend if you can do it. But I think the people talk about like, hey, does the company have a strong enough culture to be able to handle remote work? And I actually think about that a little bit differently. I think culture is a little too broad of a stroke. I think it is more of, does leadership have enough operational excellence and high enough standards for remote work to make it feasible? Because it is so much easier to get away with less, like just not meeting the bar or meeting standards when you are in a remote setting because there's no one watching you. The same reason, right? They do paired programming where people are on the same computer engineering the same stuff because they found working together in that confined space keeps you more focused. And so I think the leadership has to have a lot of, be strong at communicating the operational excellence, the EPs, the standards, and enforcing that. And if not, then you should probably default in person.
So I like this. I haven't asked your opinion on this before, so this is new to me, and I like this. And I have something that I think complements this. So I was rolling out teams across the world, and it didn't make sense to have multiple teams or people in some of the countries we were hiring in. So like at an office in Dubai, or like a rep in Dubai, a rep in Cape Town, a rep in Barcelona. And so I'd been doing this far before remote was really a thing, just because we had been doing this. We had to. It wasn't an option of like making a decision. It was the path to grow the company in a practical way.
And the context was that you were working for some European-based companies or helping out some European-based companies, right?
No, this was when I was leading team for a company called Renate. It was a US-based company selling to hotels, and we expanded into Europe. So we had a hub in Amsterdam for Europe, but then also we were going into these tertiary markets that you needed to be in person to sell, that had a lot of revenue potential. These massive hotels in Dubai or in the Middle East.
You needed salespeople local.
Yeah, and there was a lot of revenue. I mean, it's interesting. South Africa really loves to buy from South African companies, so it's less about being in person, but having a presence there. And so if you have a presence, you're considered kind of South African company and they'll buy from you. And so, But if you don't have a presence there, you're definitely not, and they won't buy from you. I mean, they will if they have to, but like, it just like opens all these doors. And so we saw this in all these tertiary markets, but it didn't make sense to build an office there. The market's not that big. So I've already been experimenting with that, and it worked really well when we already had this solidified playbooks for these reps. We could hire them and say, here's the playbook. We knew what to do. We knew what to expect from them, with the market being the variable or the rep being the variable, but not the playbook. And so that was all good until we rolled out new products. We rolled out a new product. There was a steep learning curve to figure out how to sell it. And that's when things started to like shape my thesis that I have that I'll share in a minute. But basically, we would roll out new products, and some people in some markets would sell really well and other people wouldn't. And we couldn't really figure out why. It was much harder and longer to figure out the variables. Is it the market? Is it the person? Is it the playbook? Is it all these variables? And so what I started to learn, and I've been applying this when we're going remote or making these decisions, is when you're learning, you learn much faster together. And when you already have a solidified playbook, you know what to expect from the sales rep that you hire in Wyoming to execute this plan, even though he or she will never be in an office or very rarely will ever come to the HQ if there's one, or these summit events that we're talking about with like team gatherings. And so what I realized was when it's time to learn and when it's time to figure stuff out, being together is fast and efficient, and you can understand all the variables. But when you have the playbook built out and you have a lot of structure, and I think that goes to your point of when you have management that can manage with rigor, that's when going remote becomes a lot easier, because the only variable is really the person executing the playbook versus the playbook, the market, the learning, all of these things. So it's a bit of a maturity in the business. And so when you said like, yes, if you're constrained with talent, you got to scale really big. Well, you shouldn't be scaling without clear playbooks and a predictability in the business, which would imply that you then can scale and hire remote people because they have a high likelihood of success. Now I'll add one other piece. Sorry, continue.
So do you think all early stage teams, call it less than 5 people, less than 10 people, should be in person?
I advocate strongly to do that unless there's very real exceptions to that with maybe a very trusted person, right, that can do a very specific thing that can't be in that office. And so one of the things that furthered this belief that I have is my friend's a CRO at Travel Perk. I've been able to interview him on a few panels, and he's very passionate about these topics. And he found that remote would be ideal. Everybody kind of wants that. But what he found was if you're not being trained, so again, this learning period of, like, to your point, learning in person or training in person, if you're not in an office learning the culture, I guess, but the training, the processes, having those resources around you, you have a much higher likelihood of failure, like a 50% failure rate versus like a 10% failure rate. And so what he's done is these hub models where he has built up, where it's more of a training center. Also, you can go there to work whenever you want, but you don't have to be there. But you have to be there at the beginning. And so it's funny because he says a lot of applicants are like, well, I don't really want to be in person. I have this other offer from this remote company. He said, well, we find if you join a company remote, right, especially if you're more junior, you have a very high failure rate. We do this to set you up for success. And after 6 months, if you're performing and showing that you can do this, then you can work from wherever. We don't care. So it's an interesting model that they're doing some of these hybrid models, much later stage company, but they've also found that training and getting someone ramped up in that learning experience in person sets them up for long-term success. Here you go, you can be remote. And so it's starting to, like, again, frame that thesis of timing of the company, or what are you trying to achieve and how efficient is it? And what are the trade-offs or the risk rewards with this flexibility?
Yeah. I think you brought up a good point. I think I basically think of everything in life as trade-offs. And I think you're right. I think you do learn faster. You do learn faster in person, right? That's like pretty standard, like pretty widely accepted. But I think if you're going to hire remotely, you need to be better at interviewing, and you need to have more rigor and intellectual honesty in your process. because you're going to have less opportunity to learn fast in person. And I think it's probably in some ways, right? I think there's an advantage for companies that can interview really well, is that if they can interview really well, they can get that access to all the talent in the world, and they're making better hiring decisions, and they don't have to worry about the washout rate being 50% because they've interviewed so well.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Or continue. No, you finish.
Oh, I should say there's just something to be said about how important interviewing is, and potential things that whether they're biases or things that you just pick up on, signals you pick up on when you're interviewing someone in person that are different, that I think probably make us less rigorous in like a fully objective interview process.
I agree. Now, so I have a question for you. I was talking to a head of sales, and he spot checks his sales reps' calendars and will just Slack them when there's openings and see how long it takes them to get back. And often he finds they'll get back at like the next hour. So basically what they've been doing is they're not actually working. They're, being reactive to their calendar versus filling that time of like prospecting or whatever.
Right.
And I said to him, man, that really feels like micromanagement. And he said, oh yeah. He's like, with remote work, there's no such thing as micromanagement. That's just management now. Now, this might be heavy-handed, but the idea is that like there's a very important level of trust, like you said, with this interview process, that you're hiring people that are going to be proactive and are going to fill their time with prospecting or other activities versus like taking those times in between to have a very light, not quite quitting schedule, but a very light kind of schedule. And so I think that's interesting also for us older people that have been schooled in office, that we were trained by managers who were working in office, and we were trained to be, how to work. And then when we go remote, well, we know how to work. I'm not saying we always do it as well as we should, but we know how to do it. A junior person who has never been kind of taught that way and is remote is a bigger liability because they don't really understand how to work. Also, I've been interviewing people. I interviewed a guy the other day as a star. He's like, I got 5 roommates. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, well, we all have desks in our rooms, and, we all work from our bedrooms, and we black out the screen in the background and blur it out because we have a tiny shoebox bedroom with a bed there, and it's not that professional. And I also use the analogy, if it's midnight and I have to be in an office with a manager who's going to be like there with me seeing my performance, am I going to stay out a bit later, or am I going to go home? Versus if I'm just going to be in my bedroom, kind of on Slack, doing a junior sales activity like prospecting that I can actually kind of mail in the beginning of the day because I'm maybe a bit hungover. Like, am I really going to do that? And so there's like this interesting, like, well, do you hire junior people because there's a high failure rate and there's more variability remote, or you only hire senior people because they've already learned how to work? There's like this weird dynamic that's happening. And so like, what's your thought on this challenge of the junior roles entering a workforce of remote only and trying to learn what high productivity is? And do you have to micromanage them this way to really like make sure they're in the ofce? Because when it's in person, and when it's remote, they could be in the pool. I don't know.
Well, so I think there was certainly a narrative going around in like 2021 when jobs started to come back really hard and things were remote, where people were like, don't measure my FaceTime, measure my results. And they were like super gung-ho about this stuff. And I think particularly with sales, right? Like, listen, there's always, this has been
I'm going to say that to you next time I have a moment. Don't measure my FaceTime, measure my results.
Right. And like sales has a built-in governor for this because you can look at the scoreboard, right? So that's part of it. And I think this goes back to hiring. It goes back, there's probably 2 main inputs. It goes back to your hiring process, and it goes back to the things that you're measuring from an activity or result standpoint with them and how you're communicating those standards, which is under that umbrella of operational excellence. And so I think with most young people, regardless, there's some opportunity for you to do some type of reference or look in their background or figure out in the interview process how receptive they are to downtime or how engaged they are. Right. You can look
and
at
how disciplined they are already and how disciplined will they be in their job.
Right. Because, and I'll say this, people go through their own seasons of discipline. I was certainly not nearly as disciplined the first 4 years of my career as I have been in the preceding 10 to 12 years of my career.
That was 50 years ago. So
that was a long time ago.
There was no computers then.
Right. But that was a switch for me personally. And so if someone had just looked at my first 4 years of my career and said like, oh, is this guy going to really be ambitious and go after things? And they like had observed me for 4 years in the office, they probably would have said no. It wasn't more till my back was against the wall and I was a commission only salesperson that kind of switch flipped.
But I wonder if you like do that compounding it with like fresh out of university or college and you're living with 5 buddies and you don't have to go to an office. Like how does then it's like it just feels like it starts to become more of an extreme divide of like, are you serious and are you disciplined or are you just like getting a job because everyone does, but you are not susceptible or not like open to being disciplined and you're going to kind of fight against this and try to mail it in as much as possible.
Well, I think so. Let's assume you made the right read based on your interview inputs, right? Like the references, everything else came back good enough on this person. I think then it goes back to, I think what your friend is doing, I think is not a bad idea to check in, see what that response time is like. But that's a signal, right? How you do anything is how you do everything in many ways. And so like you should take that as a signal. But I wouldn't give someone more than like a few chances on that, right? I would give them that feedback. And if they don't react or update their behavior accordingly, then it's probably not the right place for them because
Well, and I mean, this was an interesting one, but the idea of like, it's a little bit of like Big Brother's watching, but if Big Brother has to be watching, there's a trust issue, in which case is probably due to a performance issue, which should be corrected in a more disciplined approach to your job so that your output is successful. So you don't have to be checking in on what they're doing right now.
right. But I think, listen, any good manager is going to taste the soup at some point, right? And so,
Yeah, no, and that's why I was just
like,
like, this is a one-off instance, but it also made me think like, wow, other people are doing this. Like, this is not.
oh yeah,
And if you're
right,
not, you're wondering what they're doing if you're not actually doing it.
right. And so I think it goes back to like how you're setting up your incentives internally and how you manage them, how you set expectations. And so, listen, it's basically just kind of the new world order of the way that you have to think about things. But I don't know if I'd go as extreme to say like micromanagement is just the new standard of management. I would just say more of like, hey, people may feel uncomfortable that I check in on them about this stuff, but it's a signal to me that's indicative of whether or not they are truly engaged in their job.
Is there anything we're missing on this remote topic of like these early stage phase-based things? Any other outliers that have like you've seen be maybe we'll kind of wrap this up on any catastrophic things you've seen or like really extreme best practices with remote or the evolution towards remote?
I think
All right, I have a
I
question. Sorry. Okay,
oh,
go
go.
ahead. Some people are doing office mandatory.
Right.
I was managing a head of sales, or I was advising a head of sales, and he said recruiters were coming to him and they were like, hey, we got this remote. Like they were selling it as remote being beneficial.
Right.
And he was saying, do you have any not remote opportunities? I want to actually work in an office. And they were like, yeah, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of head of sales just want to be in an office with their team having a good time, right? That's where
Right.
we started this conversation. And so people mandating in office, like back to work, back to the office with sales teams or building sales teams from scratch in one location, obviously the hiring becomes constrained. You have a smaller market. But are you seeing that happening, working, or failing?
I have seen it. Well, first of all, I think for the rest of the world, I think I've seen it plateau for the most part, right? The companies that are mandating it have already mandated it. The companies that aren't. And most companies at this point aren't shifting their stance drastically, at least from what I've seen. I'm speaking with their CRO this afternoon from Link Squares, and they pretty hardcore in-office culture, especially for sales. And Steve, who's like a very charismatic and really great sales leader, was as soon as they could get back to the office, he talked about it endlessly. Like, hey, come work for us. We're happy to have you. You have to be in office. We learn much more together. We're going through all this together. And for what it's worth, like he's built
You'll be more
incredible
successful and
followership.
you'll have more fun is probably his pitch, right? I mean,
Right. And I think his team loves him. He's built incredible followership. But recently, like a month ago, they decided to move to a hybrid schedule. And
okay.
they did this after polling the team and getting feedback from them. And I think it's either 3 or 4 days a week in the office. It might just be Fridays that they're out of the office. And I think this will probably for them go down as a pretty big success story because they've continued to grow over the last few years. They took feedback from their team and they were humble enough to make a change, which I think a lot of leaders wouldn't make that change. They would just kind of dig their heels in more and know like, this is what I think the best.
So I have a controversial take.
Sure.
Giving someone the option to work in an office or remote, I think we all, including myself, choose remote. Is that what's best for the organization and actually for the employee? because I think some of the best work I've done has been in office with people that I'm sure would have chosen to be remote, and we wouldn't have had those opportunities or that success. So I would wonder, asking Steve, like, hey, good experiment. Like, are you going to be more successful with this model? And maybe it will be more successful because they were already in office. Again, they've already learned, they're already solidified, they know how to work. Then they go remote, it's much easier. So it's not really a true test of like all things being
But
equal because there's that history there.
what I think what it actually is, it's actually an incredible case study in business, because in business, like, you are going to face things that no one could ever prepare you for, right? And it happens
Mhm.
all the time. And you need to be able to adapt to figure out what's best for the business. And sometimes what's best for the business is just what's best for the employees. And sometimes you need to be able to let those employees go, even though they could be good for the business, because it's not the best thing for the business, right? Like, I'm sure you've dealt with like the rogue
The
mercenary
brilliant
sales
jerk.
rep that crushes it, but doesn't listen to any of the rules, sloppy CRM, whatever it is. And on net, like, that revenue might not be worth it in the long term because it could be a cancer to the culture. And so I think that the biggest takeaway from all this is that you have to be really adaptable, and you have to flex into whatever is right for that current season of your business. And I think, generally speaking, to your point, earlier stage teams, founding teams will operate better together in the same physical space. But if you can create some of that culture or build some really good operational excellence, then you can still find lots of success going remote.
And attract even better talent anywhere on
Yeah.
Earth. Yeah.
Yeah. Which could be really great for the business.
Yes. Like
So
we seasonal, both life and business.
it's all about
We're in
seasons,
the
man.
we're in the spring season of Revenue Blueprint.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, I think we hit this topic pretty hard today. I hope people enjoyed this, and I'm sure there'll be a few folks that reach out about their thoughts on in person versus hybrid versus fully remote, especially for sales teams, because it's been something that's been talked about ad nauseam for the last 3 years.
Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you so
All right.
much.
That's a wrap. See you guys soon.
Peace.